Oh, it's 6 o'clock. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the British Empire Study Group on Bastille Day. And happy Bastille Day to everybody, an appropriate topic that we're having tonight. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, we are the British Empire Study Group. We are made up of men and women who have an interest in the British Empire. That's a very broad term. So we do a lot of social things, and we would usually meet in Midtown Manhattan, but the Collectors Club is doing some reorganization, so we're open to spots. And for the near future, we'll be doing webinars like this predominantly. So what is the British Empire? We take a very liberal view of the British Empire. We even like our French people here. And so basically, if it's flown over the British Empire, if it was once part of the British Empire, if mail went through the country, even though it's not part of the British Empire, it's all fair game for us. So just a little housekeeping. Our next meeting will be on Zoom on August 11th, and that's with Garfield. He'll be going over Toronto Post Office's Part 2. He has a great new discovery when he was up in Capex. He wouldn't really tell me about it, but he said we'll be surprised. So a little more housekeeping. If you could feel free to chat. It would be nice if you put the questions either in the Q&A or the chat. Following the presentation, there'll be a social discussion. So if you'd like to wait and just talk to Ken or Rob directly, feel free. If you don't like those little closed captions, if they're coming up, please just click on the disable closed subtitles and you could disable them. If you don't see that button, hit the more, and then you'll see the disable the live transcripts. If you're interested in any topics, please let us know. And I just wanted to, at this time, if you have your gallery up, you'll see Rob Wheaton's here. He's going to be introducing our speaker. And I'm not going to try Ken's last name because I'm going to butcher it again, but Ken is a fantastic person. So Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you to do the introductions if I could.
All right, thanks, John. Good evening, everyone. You're in for a real treat tonight. It's my honor to introduce our presenter this evening, Ken Nilsestuen. He's been a student of Algerian postal history for at least 30 years, and he's an expert in this area of philately. An APS member since 1979 and about to finish his term as treasurer of the American Philatelic Research Library. He's also president of the U.S. France and Colonies Philatelic Society, the Institute of Analytical Philately, and secretary of the American Association of Philatelic Exhibitors. Whew. Ken's also an accredited chief judge and author, having published numerous articles for the American Philatelist, along with several other publications. Some of you might even be familiar with him as the host of a monthly Zoom meeting for the France and Colonies Philatelic Society. Without any further ado, I bring you our presenter, Ken Nilsestuen.
Thank you, Rob. Give me a minute to share my screen. I appreciate the fine introduction. I hope I live up to everybody's expectations tonight. The subject, as all of you saw, is the history of the Barbary pirates and the Europeans in Algeria. And that was actually suggested by Joan when I sent her a version of this that was more focused on France than it was on the rest of Europe. And she sent it back with this title. So I knew at that point I had my title. Let's get this thing to, there we go. The keys are working. That's a good thing. So we know that the Mediterranean Sea, the focus of all of this, has been active for a long, long time, since probably long before recorded history. We know about the Roman Empire and the Carthaginian Empire, the Punic Wars, and so on, all took place in and around the Mediterranean. Our story about the pirates, however, starts in the late 14th century. At this point, we've got corsairs, Turkish corsairs, who begin raiding regularly from Algiers and Tunisia and Morocco all other shipping in the Mediterranean Sea, all other boats in the Mediterranean Sea. So what do the Europeans do to respond? They ended up attacking Tunisia, which slowed things down a little bit. In 1492, while those of us on the North American continent celebrate Columbus having arrived here, it's also the time when the Moors were ejected from Spain and went back to Africa. And at that point, they began attacking Christian shipping in the Mediterranean. In the early 1500s, Ferdinand, the Spanish king, and that's the same Ferdinand of Ferdinand and Isabella who funded Columbus's voyage, captured Oran, which is Western Algeria, and Bougie, which is a little further east, and also the Peñon at Algiers. And I will butcher every foreign term because English is my first and more or less only language. This Peñon was a little island out close to the coast of Algiers, but just far enough out that it was not easily accessible. So now we've got the Spanish presence in 3 cities across the north coast of what becomes Algeria. And I'll talk just briefly to describe what's going on. North Africa at the time is not organized in countries. There is no Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia at this point. So in my presentation, I refer to Algerines as people from Algiers, not necessarily from Oran, Bougie, or any other place along the coast. It wasn't until 1839 that the French began referring to their conquered territory as Algeria, which derived from the city of Algiers, but that was really the first time that the country name appeared. All right, so the Arabs were pretty unhappy that the Spanish are out sitting off the coast of Algiers, so they retook the Peñon in 1529. They tore apart the fortress the Spanish had built and turned it into a causeway so that they could connect the Peñon to the mainland. And that still is there today. This is really when the Barbary corsairs take off. One fair question is, how in the world did the corsairs succeed for so long? And I think there are a couple of main reasons for this. The first is there just wasn't enough common purpose among the Europeans, because for this entire period of time, some fraction of Europe is at war with another fraction of Europe, whether it's the British, the Dutch, the French, the Spanish. The Germans were not united yet, but the city-states of Germany and so on. The Italians were not united yet as Italy. They're all fighting amongst themselves. And so they don't really have sufficient political cause to come together and suppress the Turks in North Africa. That's one reason. And the second is that they all kept trying to do business with the pirates, saying, you know, if we pay you enough money, will you leave us alone? And the pirates would say, oh, sure, send us money and we'll leave you alone. But they really had no time for the Christians. And so these agreements typically didn't last very long. The political leaders of North Africa would complain that the Europeans weren't making the payments they'd agreed to under the agreements, whatever it might be, and they would just continue their piracy against everybody. Here's a map of Algiers from 1579. And of course, we know that modern perspective and 16th century perspective are not the same, but you can see the wall around the city. And today that wall is still there, outlining what we call the Kasbah today. And at the bottom of the picture, let's see, I can make a pointer here. Right here, oops, no, that didn't work. I thought I made a pointer, but I didn't. At the bottom of the picture, slightly to the right, you see the straight lines coming down into the Mediterranean. That's the mole, that's the causeway that they built out to the Peñon. You also get a sense for what the ships looked like from the drawings of what's included here too. This is the third time I have purchased the oldest surviving letter from Algiers. And I think I may have made it this time. 1597 is really getting back there. This letter turned up very unexpectedly in a French auction. When I was at Washington in 2006, there was actually a Turkish stamp dealer there traveling with one of the major European auction houses. I can't remember if it was Feldman or Cornfilla, but he assured me that there were no letters that had come out of North Africa into Turkey that still survived. Well, this one did, and it showed up about 3 or 4 years ago now. It's a ship letter. There's no formal postal service between Algiers and Turkey at this time. And in fact, most of the time, you'll see this later on, the communications from Turks to Turkey would typically say, I'm entrusting the message to my courier, ask him what I'm trying to communicate to you, and it would not be in the written communication. So the letter was addressed to Pira, which is still a district in Istanbul. It was a commercial area that was more populated by Italians and other Europeans at this time. It is the only reported letter from Algiers to Turkey at all until, into the mid-19th century after the French occupied Northern Africa. I've not had it translated, although I showed it to Sergio Sismondo, who many of you may know, and he looked at it and he said, Ken, you really ought to have this translated, but it's in a Milanese dialect, and I just have no way to figure this out for you. So I'm looking for somebody who is willing to spend some time in return for something from me to tell me what the letter says. The one word that we were able to figure out is the word Colombo, which is the Italian word describing Christopher Columbus, this letter being written only 105 years after Columbus discovered Hispaniola in North America. So it's entirely possible that this letter would have mentioned Columbus or his adventures as something going back and forth between the writer and the recipient. Here's a couple of pieces of the certificate. I'd never seen one from the Turkish Philatelic Federation before. The left-hand side is actually type A4 paper, so it's cropped from the top of that. And the back is the exportizing mark tying the photocopy to the cert. And as you can see, it says it's the only recorded cover. And I don't know what they mean by that, whether it's the only one recorded to Turkey or the only one from the 16th century or the only one they've ever seen. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's still, to me, a good sign that my letter is the real thing. And I'm very hopeful that I have now the really oldest letter from Algiers. So what was going on now? It's around 1600. We know the pirate headquarters is in Algiers, even though they've got pirates in Oran, Tunis, and Tripoli, all Turkish. The Europeans are busy spending money to keep the Turks from attacking their shipping in the Mediterranean. The Turks would take their sailors, they would take the passengers, men, women, children, it didn't matter. If they were craftsmen, they would typically put them to work. So a shoemaker might be employed as a slave of a shoemaker in Algiers or Oran. If they were capable of household duties, if they were educated, they would be treated a little better rather than just put into a galley and turned into an oar puller. The slaves could be ransomed because the one thing the Turks always liked was money. So some of the correspondence you'll see is letters from these slaves writing back home saying, hey, don't forget about me because I could be ransomed out if you guys would put up some money for me. It worked sometimes, it didn't work always. And usually the Deys would demand a fair amount of money to ransom a slave out. And it was hard to raise that much money. So people who were captured as slaves ended up spending quite a bit of time in slavery. It wasn't one-sided. The Europeans also captured the corsairs, and I think they used them to trade if they could. Sometimes I think the Turks simply didn't care because they could always go get some more Christians. They didn't care if somebody wanted to trade for their own people. Clearly, the main business of the Turks was not making things, it was not agriculture, it was capturing slaves and booty out in the Mediterranean. How did the Algerines govern themselves? Well, when this started, the Turks would appoint a pasha, and that pasha would directly report to the Turkish council, which was called the Porte. Then the Turkish Algerine army decided, we don't like that so much because the Turks don't always send a good person over. So they started appointing their own pasha, but it was still subject to approval by the Turkish Sultan. In 1661, the army created a new title, the Aga, which was not subject to Turkish approval and essentially said, come tell us you don't agree if you choose, but recognize we are the army over here in North Africa. So it just kind of happened and the Turks let it go. In 1671, 10 years later, the army changed the title to Dey, and the Dey became the effective military and political leader of Algiers. After 1710, and the Dey and the Pasha were the same person. So at this point, the Turkish Sultan is simply not part of this anymore. But the Algerines also had a divan or a council, and they were used like a rump parliament or something like that. But essentially the people on the divan were also self-appointed or appointed. It is important to note that being the Dey of Algiers was not necessarily a good career choice. Only about 1 in 12 of all the Deys ended up dying of natural causes, which is not a good perspective. How about the British? This is the British Empire Study Group, and Joan did ask me to focus more on the British than on the French, so I've tried to do that. You can see here that the original consuls were actually just people there working for like the Turkey Company, the equivalent of the British East India Company, for example, but in North Africa or in the addressing the Ottoman Empire rather than India. So it was corporate entities, and the consuls were really representing the corporations trying to do business with the pirates in North Africa. Tipton was the representative of the Turkey Company in as early as 1580, which may be the first time we see something like a consul operating in Algiers. He's officially appointed in 1585, and his consulate really extends to Tunis and Tripoli, so it extends to the east. And the Sultan approved this, which I think was important, because if the Sultan had not approved the consul, the Turks might have just stepped in and beheaded the guy. But at the same time, it was the kind of a, what do you want to say, a point of weakness that the Sultan would have enough power that he could approve the British consul. There's a real balance there, and I'm not sure how it developed. We know from one of the texts that I used that the first letter written from Algiers, from the Dey of Algiers to England, is to Elizabeth I in 1600, and it does refer to the Spanish as a mutual enemy. And the first letter we see coming the other way to the consul is 1602. And I will say here, I'll say it again later, most of the British correspondence is archived. So it is not generally available to collectors. You will not see much in the way of British correspondence coming out of Algiers in my talk tonight. I bought this one as the oldest letter at one time before I found the one from 1597. So this was the second one I purchased as the oldest letter. It's written from Algiers to Marseille. It's, I think, a commercial letter. It's very difficult for me to figure out what the handwriting says, but you can see there's kind of a halfway between the Middle Ages script and the more modern handwriting that all of us would be able to read. Here's the inside of the letter. Some Frenchman has owned this before me and was kind enough to pencil in their interpretation of the French words, but unfortunately that penciling in is fading and I really can't read it very well. But you do see that the signature of whoever signed this is slightly more modern handwriting than the script used for the body of the letter. This is typical of what happened to European shipping when they were in the Mediterranean. The pirates in the two smaller boats here would attack in as much force as they thought they needed. The Europeans were defending their lives in slavery or the booty or the whatever they were carrying as cargo. And so they were fighting essentially for their lives. The pirates, not so much. They were just out there trying to get a little bit richer. And of course, anybody handling an oar on those smaller boats was likely to be a slave. So James I, who was also James VI of Scotland, I don't need to inform the British people online tonight about the history, but James I became King of England and Ireland in 1603 when Elizabeth I died. He was in 1920 when he sent this Admiral Monson down to Algiers to start a campaign against the pirates. King James I was 53 years old. He died in 1625, so he was alive throughout this campaign. However, it wasn't a big enough deal historically that if you go online and look him up, that it gets any mention, because James I was much more involved in things like the gunpowder plot or translating the Bible and in colonizing America, which was a much bigger deal than the pirates in North Africa. It's important to point out here that next to the last bullet, that our consul at the time, Frizzell, was mostly trying to ransom slaves. And a lot of it came out of his own pocket, and a consistent theme among the British consuls, and I think other countries as well, was they would use their own fortune expecting to be repaid by the crown, and it often did not happen. Baltimore, Ireland. Now, Charles I is king, and the pirates actually sailed all the way up the Atlantic to Baltimore, Ireland, which is on the very southern coast. They carried off 237 people in 1631 and put them in slavery. They were actually led by a Flemish renegade, which gives you a taste for why the Europeans were at war with each other all the time. And I may be a little harsh by saying the town never recovered. I think that's a quote from the 1884 book that I was reading about the British in North Africa. But even today, there's only about 400 people in Baltimore, Ireland. It's a little place. You can see it in Google Maps, and it might be a place for a vacation, but it doesn't look like there's much commerce there anymore. The pirates didn't raid just Baltimore. They were busy raiding on the English island itself, on Great Britain itself. And when people were enslaved, they were constantly going to Parliament or to the king and asking for them to redeem their enslaved relatives out of North Africa. Ultimately, Parliament's response was they enacted a 1% duty on all imports and exports, and they were supposed to use that as ransom, but I don't know that ever turned out super well, that it resulted in a lot of people being brought back out of slavery. So now we're under Cromwell in the after 1649 at any rate. We've got the slave owners who are saying, yeah, we'll take ransom, but if it's a good slave, we don't want to let them go, so we'll let you have all the duds. But Cassin was able to redeem out about 240 slaves in 1647, which wasn't a whole lot. You'll see later on that there were a lot of Christian slaves in North Africa. His efforts resulted in this peace until the end of the world, which I think is hilarious, approved by Parliament, and it really didn't last very long. None of the treaties lasted very long. Cromwell did send General Blake, who went to Tunis, not Algiers, and defeated them in 1654, but he then used that victory to go back to Algiers and redeem out some slaves. Here's a letter, a document. I'm not sure it's a letter. It doesn't look like it went through the post. It hasn't been folded and sealed the way you would expect it to be if it were. But it's a letter written in Spanish. It's sewn around a second document you'll see on the next page. And because I don't read Spanish at all, I unfortunately can't tell you what it says other than you can see sort of standing out about a third of the way down on the right side, the number 1647, which is the year date. This is the inside document, and I have highlighted that at the bottom of it, it does say that it was written in Oran, and the next line is the year in, or the date in Spanish written out in words rather than 1647. There's a whole bunch of signatures at the bottom. I don't know what the document is, and I would love to find somebody with some patience who would fish through this and at least tell me what it's about. I don't necessarily need to know word for word what it says. Now we're up to 1655. We've got a new consul, Robert Brown, English consul this is. Cromwell is still in charge back in England. The Algerines are still acting like pirates. And Cromwell appoints Lord Winchelsea, or maybe Parliament, I don't understand for sure who was in charge at that time. He's the ambassador to Turkey, and he stops off in Algiers to kind of check up on things. He negotiated a new treaty, but in that treaty, England agrees that the Turks can board and search English vessels, which seems again like a relatively weak thing for a naval power like Britain to agree to. So in about 1660, John Lawson shows up. He points his cannons at the harbor and amends the treaty that says the pirates can no longer search English vessels. But of course, they never intended to abide by the terms, so they really didn't care what they agreed to. And unfortunately, Consul Brown then dies in 1663 of the plague, which is not uncommon. Cholera, typhoid, yellow fever, plague, all very common in North Africa. So in this period right after the Commonwealth, the restoration of the monarchy, Charles II is now in charge. He sent lots of consuls down there, but if you go look him up on any website, his activities or his relationship with North Africa simply isn't important enough to be mentioned. So I'm glad that I had this text available to me that talked about Charles and what was going on. Again, it's important. The Algerines consistently acted in bad faith. They didn't, when they agreed to something, they didn't intend to stand by it. And as a result, Algiers is really at war with everybody, not just England. As an example, John Ward, the English consul, was imprisoned in his house. The Dey just said, I'm ticked off at you and the British, and so they locked him away. And then in 1674, they hacked him up in front of the Dey's palace. What a way to go. I refer to Playfair. Robert, you'll see at the end, I have a slide with references, but Robert Playfair wrote a book in 1884 called The Scourge of Christendom about all that was going on in North Africa. And he's a source for much of the British history that you see tonight. He says in 1680, there's about 900 slaves in Algiers. You can go online and find people who have easily refuted that, saying that there were 800 to 900 slaves a month being taken off British ships in the Mediterranean. So they think that the real total is much closer to 20,000 slaves in Algiers. That's a heck of a lot of people. Here's a letter, which is the first one I bought, thinking it was the oldest ever letter from Algiers. And I wasn't making this up. It was the way the auctioneer was describing these 3 letters that you've seen. So this was the first one I bought as the oldest surviving letter. And in it, Mr. Zafi has been enslaved for a number of years, and he is asking his family to ransom him from Ali Race. And he describes how his ship was captured by 6 pirate ships, not just the 2 you saw in the painting. The ship was burned. He was luckily alive at the end of it, but hauled off into slavery, and he is not having a good life. The letter is addressed to Livorno, Italy, and where I have the English or the overlay on the letter, it says in Italian, the letter of a poor slave. The hangman's noose over on the right-hand side is an encouragement to get this letter delivered on pain of death. So he's making every effort to get himself out of slavery. This document was provided to me by, or a scan by Winston Williams, who was on our call as a participant tonight. He wrote to me when he saw my France and Colonies presentation of this, and he was kind enough to provide not only a scan of the document, but also a translation of it. And it describes how Paolo Alfonso, the subject of this, has been ransomed out of slavery. The document is signed by the French consul, Jean Levacher, and it tells us he's 23 years old. He'd been a slave since he was 15 or 16 years old. It refers to Algiers as Julia Caesarea, which was the Latin name for Algiers. So this is quite a document. And I think effectively Alfonso would have carried this around as a more or less a passport to say, I'm good. I've been bought, so don't take me back again. Here's an engraving that somebody did many years ago. You can find this online pretty easily. And it shows the Turks sitting at the table, the Christians at the right with little sacks of gold coins or silver coins. And at the left on their knees are Christian slaves hoping to be redeemed out by the exchange of money, and their captors beating them into submission while they're there. It was not a good life. This document was offered on either Del Camp or eBay. I can't remember which, but it's a 1678 pamphlet written in Spanish, and it's I think it's 12 pages. I didn't buy it, and I'm not sure the entire thing was scanned when the person selling it offered it. But it talks about the plague in Algiers and how the plague had killed 200,000 Moors. That's, again, a lot of people in one place, and 5,000 Christians. So if it killed a quarter of the Christian population, there were 20,000 slaves. If it killed a third of them, there were 15,000 slaves. Whatever it was a lot more than Playfair's estimate of 900. This order, which published the pamphlet, Our Lady of Mercy, was founded in 1218, and it was devoted to redeeming captured slaves out of Algiers. Now the French. In 1681, the French decide they've had enough of this also. So in 1682, they went down and bombed Algiers. And by bombing, of course, it means ships sailed into the harbor and fired cannons at them. Came back in 1683, led by the gentleman you see here, Abraham Duquesne, who was the Marquis de Boucher. He reportedly was his campaign was reportedly the first use of artillery shells, which would be something that explodes rather than something like a cannonball, which simply by the force of its momentum tore off limbs, killed people, bounced off in odd directions when it hit something, and so on. So cannonballs were plenty scary, but artillery shells exploding actually would be much worse, creating all the shrapnel that goes with it. The Janissaries, the Algerines, were not very happy that Duquesne had shown up the second time, and so they revolted against the Dey, and one more time, the Dey was murdered. Duquesne could claim somewhat of a success. Despite the French consul, Lavacher, who was the guy who signed that passport we saw a couple of slides ago, he was literally tied to a cannon and blown away. So even the French consuls came to bad ends as well. But Duquesne was able to rescue more than 100 French captives and take them away. And they reached a 100-year treaty, but it only lasted 5 years. But in 1688, they negotiated a new treaty, and that one was respected until, until the next time things blew up, not very far into the future. So now we're in the 1680s. We've got a new British consul, General Erlesman. He shows up in 1684, and I'll point this out later too, but many times the consul would be appointed and it would take him 2 or 3 years before he had his affairs in order in England and could depart for the north coast of Africa. The Turkish ambassador again stopped off and reconfirmed the 1683 treaty. That was the one that was going to last 100 years. Then the French show up at the urging of Louis XIV. They attack Algiers in 1687. In 1688, they attack again and again and again, trying to suppress the piracy. And at this point, we think a second French consul, André Piot, was also tied to the same cannon and blown away. And as a result, they named the cannon Le Consular for having blown up 2 consuls. However, that may only be a rumor. It may be that Piot was beaten to death and instead they blew up a bunch of Christians by tying them to the cannon. At any rate, in 1688, they concluded a new peace. The British consul lived through all of this and died in 1690. Here's another map, now 1695, 100 years later than the previous one you saw. And you can more distinctly see the triangular shape of Algiers going up the side of the hill. And again, that's today the Casbah. You cannot see the mole in the fortress very clearly in the foreground, but you do again get a sense of the pirates using any ships they could commandeer to commit their acts of piracy in the Mediterranean. Why did that stop working? Well, let me get my slide to move here. There we go. So for the next 30 years, a series of British consuls did manage to maintain relations with the Deys. They were never very good because, again, the Deys always claimed they needed more money, that the British weren't paying what they agreed to pay, that the British were capturing the corsairs and enslaving them as well. So they always had complaints. Notably, on one day, there were 3 or 4 Deys successively murdered until finally one who lasted for a while. There was a huge earthquake in 1716, and as it turns out, the north coast of Africa was reasonably seismically active at this time. I don't know if it is today or not, but the earthquake and the aftershocks lasted about a month in 1716. At about this same time, a gentleman named Thomas Beton, who was member of the Worshipful Company of Ironmongers, created a charity from his estate to redeem slaves. That charity existed and continued to redeem slaves until 1835, which is after the French invaded North Africa. And since then, the trust has remains in existence to this day. You can Google it and find what it does online, but it's now reassigned to aiding children rather than redeeming slaves. Let's see, I'm trying to look at my notes as well as I go along here. I knew this wasn't the oldest letter when I bought it, by the by. But this is a letter written to Scotland, and in it, the writer is offering to serve as a commercial agent for this gentleman if he has any business in North Africa. Again, the handwriting isn't quite modern. There's no postal route, there's no markings on it of any kind, just a seal, broken seal on the back, or cutout seal on the back. Now, 50 years later, another map of Algiers. This one, the perspective is better to see the causeway or the mole extending from the fortress in the middle of the picture to the right to the shore. And again, you see the triangular shape of old Algiers. It's not that, like I say, that's the Casbah today. The city itself has expanded out from around that original wall. In 1775, the Spaniards and the Tuscans decided that they were going to invade northern Africa at Algiers, or slightly to the east of it. We're looking south in this diagram on the right. And it was a tremendous failure. They tried to come on shore to the east, where you see the ships lined up. The pink area, upper right center, is actually where Algiers itself was, and it's well fortified, as you could see in those earlier maps or drawings. They're really steep hills, and it turns out that the sand was soft. So when they brought their weapons on shore, they just sank into the sand. Not a recipe for success, but a recipe for failure. And on top of everything else, the Algerines knew they were coming, and they butchered about a quarter of the force when they landed. So the Spanish and the Tuscan force retreated. In 1784, 9 years later, actually 8 years later, a Spanish guy shows up again. This is Senor Barceló, who is in this portrait at the right. He came in and shelled the city for 8 days. Nothing happened, except the Algerines said, man, we better build better forts. So they did. Barceló came back in 1784. This time it was, again, a multinational fleet, not just Spaniards, and 11 days worth of shelling. You see here, it says more than 20,000 cannonballs were fired onto Algiers and its fortifications. It's interesting to me that they're not referred to as artillery shells, the exploding ordnance, but rather back to cannonballs, which presumably were just the ones that do plenty of damage, but did not explode. At any rate, Barceló is successful in getting a new treaty signed between Spain, Algiers, and Tunis. And it lasted until the Napoleonic Wars, which were a few years in the future still. So it's one of the better arrangements, one of the more long-lasting arrangements that the Europeans reached. Here's a letter written the next year. Now it's French. Many of the French letters are written to the Commission of Health or the head of the Commission of Health in Marseille. I don't know if the archives were broken up and sold, if these letters were stolen. I have not exhibited this in France, so I don't know if they'll try to exert replevin over it, but it's also possible that they kept one copy and sold the others, because oftentimes these letters were written in 2 or 3 or 4 copies in hopes that one of them would actually arrive safely. So it's entrusted to a captain whose name is on the front of the letter, and the DLC is the hope of the writer that God preserve the captain and his ship and that this letter arrives safely. The Spanish were still around in North Africa. This is the oldest postal marking used in Algeria, what is now Algeria, used in Oran. There were also markings used in Moroccan towns as well. And if you look in Spanish auctions, you'll see them for sale every now and then. There's reportedly, according to one of my French sources, a black version of this, but I've never seen it. So I don't know if it exists or not. To go back and talk about the history of Oran a little bit and the Europeans, Spain conquered Oran in 1509. Remember, the diaspora was 1492. Spain conquers Oran to suppress the piracy in 1509. It's relatively close to Spain when you look at where Oran and Algiers and Tunis are. It's certainly the closest now Algerian city. The Dey of Algiers was not happy about the Spaniards being on the north coast, so they took it back in 1708. But notice that's 200 years later, and he was taking advantage of the War of Spanish Succession, which kind of diverted the attention of the Spaniards at the time. Spain came back in 1732, but there was another big earthquake in 1790, and Spain said, you know what, we really don't need to be here anymore. Let them have this place. Here's part of the inside of the letter. The cursive is apparently pretty difficult to read, although to me, it doesn't seem that tough. It seems to be a commercial letter. I have a friend who claims he speaks fluent Spanish. He claims to be able to read it, but he was unable to help me very much, tell me what the letter says. Again, I'd love to know just the general nature of the letter. Here is a 1795 letter from Oran to Marseille, same period. But this is written from the Bay of Oran to the Bay of Marseille. And the Bay is like the vice governor, deputy governor. I don't know quite what our English term would be to be the same, or maybe the mayor, as opposed to the Dey, spelled with D like dog. The Dey was in command of the north coast of Africa. The Bay would be in charge of each town. There would be a Bay of Tunis, a Bay of Tripoli, a Bay of Oran, and so on. So the Turks are not using the revolutionary calendar. It's 1795, when that would have been in effect for the French. The Bay of Oran was the local mayor or governor. The Bay of Marseille may have been the equivalent of a Turkish consul in Marseille, because it's pretty apparent that the French accepted the presence of this person. You can see the top of the inside of the letter. It's addressed to Bey Mohammed of the African Agency at Marseille. And the signature is from Muhammad, the Bey of Oran. And they use these fancy wooden seals, carved wooden seals, to indicate who they were and to guarantee the genuineness of the correspondence. Now we move forward to 1799, and here's another Spanish postal marking, Argel being their abbreviation of Argelia, with an IA added at the end. This is the oldest reported use, remaining use of this cancel, of this marking. It was, the Spanish were in and out of Algiers, but in 1799, they didn't possess it the way, they didn't occupy Algiers. They were just there with the presence. The letter is actually written to Majorca, but it's written in French and rated in reales because it went to Spain, collected from the recipient. Here's the interior of the letter. Again, clearly written in French. There is a reference to at the top of the letter, it's the revolutionary calendar date, which is 1799. And because I could parse out the names of several, what I would call countries, but Holland, Switzerland, Naples, and so on, it does appear to be a commercial letter between these two parties. This list of consuls for this 80-year period gives you an idea of, first off, how many there were, and also there are some of these who I indicate they were a variety of characters, let's say. So we start out with a merchant. The next guy is described as a drunk. Then we have a guy who's there for a year. Then we have a guy who's there for 11 years, which is a long time. And another couple of shorter periods. The top right-hand column there, Archibald Fraser is actually, he does something to irritate the Dey, and luckily he is just sent out of the city. He is not executed. So from that standpoint, he was a lucky guy. Then who else do we have here? Oh yeah, Mr. Mace is a little further down that side. He's appointed in 1791. It takes him 3 years to get to Algiers, and then the Dey fires him, gets ticked off at him and sends him away in 1795. Mr. Bensaman, the second to the last, is a Jew, which was pretty uncommon for the British to appoint a Jewish consul, a Jewish person as a consul. But he just happened to be in the right place at the right time. So he was consul, sort of an interim or temporary consul between Masters and Falcon. And I think the reason for the overlapping date with Masters is that Masters wasn't in the city at the time. Now we're into the 19th century, we think. This is about an 1801 letter. The hand stamp at the upper right is the consular marking of the French consul in Algiers. It is not a postal marking. If you look carefully, there's a little pencil arrow under the word "to" in the heading. That word is Alicante, which is the Spanish city, a Spanish town. This letter went from Algiers to Alicante to Toulon, and the consul at Alicante applied his marking at the lower right, or I'm sorry, lower left on the letter. This one was rated in décimes, 1 franc 50 or 15 décimes, a décime being the equivalent of a dime to us in America. And it's written to Citizen Ganthome, who was appointed the Consular of State in 1799 and was in charge of the Navy. There he is, quite a gentleman. Born in 1755, lived to 1818. One of the most interesting things about him is that he carried Napoleon back from Egypt at the end of Napoleon's campaigns there. But he was the maritime prefect in Toulon in 1802. So he was living in Toulon at the time of this letter. And you can find this in his personal history. Another consular letter written the next year, and now the postal marking, which is at the upper right, sort of tilted, VDMP Toulon, which is Voie de Mer par Toulon, via sea to Toulon. It's the earliest use of that on Algiers mail or Algerine mail. It is not the earliest use of the marking itself. Again, it's a letter to the Sanitary Commission in Marseille. This letter has clearly been disinfected, and I'll show you on the next slide how I know that. Look at the inside of that letter. That paper is just as white and bright as can be. Clearly on official stationery. It's on a printed official letterhead. But again, there's a mix of revolutionary date and non-revolutionary date. You see at the top, it's the 1st of Germinal, year 10, and then down towards the bottom, the second of the last line, via par en lettre, by a letter of 11 March, most recently, and then they parenthetically put in the revolutionary date. Again, the Algiers consul has used his marking to seal the letter on the back. Dubois Thainville was the French consul at the time, a relatively well-known consul from the era. And he's talking in this letter, again, writing to the Health Commission about incidents of the plague, and that the Spanish vice consul in Oran has reported that. There's another consular letter, again to the Sanitary Commission, the Health Commission in Marseille, with the consular marking on it. The consul is still Dubois Thainville, is ticked off at the day of Algiers because the days approach to this outbreak of yellow fever is kind of it's Allah's will, so what are we going to do about it? And the beginnings of modern medicine would dictate that you try and control it in some way, but the Dey was just not interested. This is a letter where he says inside, you can see right below 1804, it says quadruplicate. So he has sent 4 copies of this letter, hoping that one of them gets through to the Health Commission in Marseille. And in the postscript, which is actually the 3rd page of the letter, he expresses his concern about yellow fever at Bonn and Oran. Here is an 1807 letter, and you see now again the Spanish Argel marking in the middle of the letter. It's very faint, rated in décimes, French postage, 15 décimes again, but it has gone to Spain, and probably because it got the Spanish cancel on it in Algiers, went on a Spanish ship, and then was transferred through Bayonne, France to Marseille. I expect that all the staining on the edges are the result of dipping the letter in vinegar, which they thought would protect against transmission of cholera or typhoid or yellow fever, etc., by touching the letter. It's clearly a business letter. The writer has been entrusted with some stuff that a person left behind. He hasn't heard from the person anymore, and he wants to be relieved of his fiduciary duty. Here's an 1809, again, a consular letter. This is now from a new consul whose name I won't begin to mispronounce. But he's again writing about the plague. He says that this ship took 70 days to cross from Smyrna to Algiers. Think of how long that is when you compare that to a 6 or 7 day Atlantic crossing with modern shipping. It had to be awful. And here are the markings on the back. It's now the French Republic. This is under Napoleon. So there's a new seal, and the eagle is the symbol in the middle. And it's the First Empire. Personal letter. At long last, we see again the VDMP Toulon marking on here. It meant the writer mentions that the French consul has disappeared. Nobody knows where he went, but he isn't in town anymore. And this one is only 5 décimes postage due, and I am not sure why, but presumably that's the correct rate. This is a letter written by Henry Staniford Blankley, who was the British consul in Algiers at the time. The only postal marking I can see is that very faint Lisboa, Portuguese marking underneath the word to. The original postage, 3 shillings 11 pence crossed out, and assessed 5 shillings postage due from, I think, his son, who was Lieutenant H.S. Blankley. You see it's addressed to Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's a very cool destination for any mail coming out of Algiers. So the letter is kind of rambling. It's clearly a personal letter. It's at least in English, so I can read it. But I spent a little time looking up the Blankleys online. The writer, Henry Staniford Blankley, was the British consul from 1806 to 1812. His daughter actually wrote a memoir that provided a lot of history about Blankley's life as the consul. To reiterate, his main job was redeeming slaves out of slavery, redeeming English citizens out of slavery. And oftentimes he was required to pay ransom from his own funds. So you needed to be a wealthy person to be a successful consul in Algiers. His son, on the other hand, doesn't seem to show up online, at least in anything that I could easily find. But his regiment was pretty important. It was founded in 1689, and it was on the British side, of course, in the War of Independence here in the United States, and was at Yorktown. The regiment had just recently returned to Nova Scotia after being in Martinique in 1809. So apparently Martinique, like Mauritius and Reunion, went back and forth between the British and the French before they agreed to settle once and for all, something that's lasted a couple hundred years anyway, who would have possession of those small islands. So now we're up to 1816. The British show up and Lord Exmouth leads the fleet. He comes in and bombs the heck out of Algiers, reaches a treaty with the Dey, and the treaty says all Christians are subject to British protection. So he sails away back to England, feeling confident that things are going to be good. Unfortunately, the Algerian troops then massacred Sicilians, Corsicans, and Sardinians who were under British care because they were Christians. And so the king says, this ain't adequate. So he sends Lord Exmouth back to Algiers to finish the job. In August 27th, 1816, he shelled Algiers with 40 gunboats. There were over 50,000 round shot fired at Algiers. HMS Queen Charlotte, the most powerful ship in the British Navy at the time, is, I think, the ship in the middle of the painting, but I am not positive. It could be the one we see only part of on the right side of the painting. And I found a letter written September 2nd. Remember, the shelling was August 27th, from Algiers harbor to London. And it's written by a gentleman named Abraham Salome, probably to T. Boozy, it just says to Mr. Boozy, on Broad Street in London, who was a bookseller. T. Boozy was a bookseller in 1806 at that address. It's rated 1 shilling. You see at the bottom, I think, Martin Greer, Peter Kelly, and Colin Tabert for their interpretation of the rates on this letter and the marking, which you'll see in a minute on the back. There's the transit marking in the circle and both transit markings. The Plymouth dock marking where the letter arrived in October, and then when it arrived 2 days later in London. Here's the author. Abraham Salome was an Egyptian Christian. He was Exmouth's interpreter. So whenever somebody was going to go talk to the Turks, Salome was their man to go talk to them. He talks about how when they made their proposal to the Turks, when they sailed into the harbor and said, stand down, we want all the Christian slaves released, they mistrusted the Turks to the point that they extended a pole over to the Turkish boat so that the Turks wouldn't have an opportunity to board their boat and overwhelm them. There was no trust amongst these two groups. But his letter describes the battle. He describes on the second page of his letter the terms of the treaty that they reached with the Dey. Turns out he wrote a book. It's about half about himself and half about his work or the battle in 1816. Excuse me while I take a drink. And it's really very interesting. I was able to go online and actually buy a copy of his original book for a reasonable price. So 1819, 3 years later, Here's a letter to Guernsey from somebody in the harbor, again at Algiers. He is writing to his sisters, and I think he is only 13 years old at the time he's writing these. He's very young, and the letter reads like he's very young. I think I have the right letter here. And his family has essentially sent him to sea to grow up. So not an uncommon practice at the time. The letter is rated 1 shilling 8, as you can see. And my British compadres here have helped me figure out how the letter traveled from Algiers to its destination in Guernsey. It is a letter written by a member of a well-known family in Guernsey, that's Saumarez. The writer's father was an admiral. This guy, the writer, became the 3rd Baron, and as people who do thematic philatelic exhibits recognize, you end up using a lot of British colonial stamps to represent ships, because that's where you can see pictures of specific British ships. Here's the Tagus, which was the ship that he was on when he wrote the letter. The reason the Tagus shows up on a Pitcairn stamp is Tagus had been there in 1814. All right, let's get back to postal history again. Here's an 1826, again, consular letter going to the Public Health Commission in Marseille. Pierre Duval is now the consul. He's replaced Dubois-Dainville and the gentleman who came after him, who I can't remember anymore. But at any rate, you see Captain Cashin has his name on the front. And the writer now is using QDC, which is Latin for an abbreviation for whom God preserve. So he wants the captain and his ship and his letter all to get to Marseille. This time, Duval is describing how a ship was seized by the pirates on its way to Gibraltar, but it should not have been, because the ship's papers were in order. But he does remark, again, it's the Health Commission, that there was no yellow fever on board the ship. This is the consul who the Dey insulted in 1827. And I have not gone back to give you the history of how the French and the Algerians got so ticked off at each other. But here is a list of complaints I found in a French auction, written, I think, in 1829, that it's not a forged or faked document, but I don't know for sure. Fortunately, it's very, very well written. You can see it's nicely spaced. It's written on half of each page, although there are some marginal comments that come along. And it goes through and lists all the things that ticked off the French about the Turks. Hussein Pasha, who's the subject of this, had become the Dey in 1818, and it's now 11 years later, and he is still the Dey of Algiers. So he has had a long career. And as it turns out, he actually survived the French invasion and went off to, I think he went off to Turkey after the French pitched him out of Algeria. But at any rate, I won't go into all the nasty details, but the Pasha was not an easy guy to get along with. They had blockaded Algiers for 2 years, and it had not changed Pasha's behavior. So here he is. Looks like a kindly old grandfather, doesn't he? He's the guy that the French overthrew in 1830. And here he is swatting Duval. There was a discussion in 1827. That's when this drawing was what it represents. That where the French basically said, we know we borrowed money from you, but something has happened since then, and we don't think we owe you all the money, so we're not going to pay you. And the Dey got so ticked off that he swatted him with his fan or fly swatter, whatever you want to consider that to be. And 3 years later, Charles X, King of France at the time, decided, I need to get the French army out of France because they're kind of restless and I don't want them to overthrow my monarchy. So he sent them off to Algiers to suppress the pirates, and that's the one that worked. So starting in June 1830, the French showed up just west of Algiers, And by 1847, they had essentially suppressed the pirates and occupied all of the northern coast of what is now Algeria. And that's it. And this slide you will find in the presentation. Playfair's book has much about British history. Salome's book is just a delightful story about himself and the expedition to Algiers in 1816. He lists all the armaments they burned up. He lists all the ships and so on. It's really very, very interesting. Winston Williams, when he corresponded with me, sent me this link to the Vincentian missionaries. And so there's some good 17th century history there. And when I did a search on Algeria, it popped up almost 200 documents, letters written within the church that are in their archives, many of which are translated, or at least there's English summaries of them. And then there's lots of internet sites. If you just look these people up by name, you'll find a lot of them. So with that, I stop my share. And Joan, I hand it back to you or to Rob.
Oh, well, I am just going to thank you. And I want to ask you where you got that Halifax cover, because that, yeah, I had my eye on that. And there's another person here where I have an eye on his cover too. So, but
a good friend of mine pointed it out in an auction house that had not, I had not done business with.
Oh, okay. Well, I am going to turn it over to Rob to ask some questions, because there are some in the Q&A. Well, I bring people over back so they could talk to you in person. And I ask the people in the audience to please turn on your cameras, turn on your mics, and interact. It's that's what we're here for. We have a lot of great people, a lot of great questions, and a lot of great knowledge, Ken. And thank you so much. Very, very fascinating. So
you're very
over
welcome.
to you, Rob.
Thanks a lot, Ken. That was wonderful. Before I start, showing some of the questions that have shown up, I just want to point out who's been on our panel tonight. Not in our panel, but our participants. Nova Scotia, Malaga, Spain, Melbourne, Australia, Mosul, Iraq, Norfolk in the UK, Salta, Argentina, and Russia. That's pretty exciting. One of the questions that was raised is, are there any diaries or accounts from former Christian slaves that you know of?
The short answer is yes. And I held one in my hand. It was written, I believe, in English and published in the mid 1500s, I want to say. It was this leather-bound book, probably 150 pages long. And unfortunately, the bookseller wanted what for me was a lot of money, because I'm a stamp collector, postal historian, and not a book collector. And at that moment, I had to decide which I was going to be, and I didn't buy it.
Okay. Somebody asked if we can define the term rump parliament. Now, we have a definition if you're not familiar with that.
Go ahead.
Well, it's the part of the Long Parliament in Britain that continued to sit after the forced exclusion of the Presbyterian members in 1648. It voted for the trial that resulted in the execution of Charles I.
Okay.
Another question was, under what circumstances would Europeans be in the Mediterranean such that they got captured?
Oh gosh, there was a great deal of commercial trade between the nations that had North Sea ports and Atlantic ports, and Italy, Greece, presumably back in the area that's now Lebanon and so on, Egypt. So those areas, let's call them, because not all of them were countries as with today's boundaries, but those areas certainly were commercially active and growing wine and olives and wheat and so on, and trading with Europeans for their own merchandise.
And then the last question that we had was, did any of the pencil markings on the letters that you've shown us change the value of these pieces?
The only pencil markings that I think are left, I could have missed some, but because I usually erase them. But the only ones I can think of are the French words in the letter written in the semi-medieval script that I can't read. And I hope not, but it doesn't matter to me. I'm not going to erase them.
Right, right. All right, well, I'll turn it back to Joan for participation with our participants out there.
Well, I think everyone should feel free to chime in. If you have a question, just open the mic. So Kenneth, do you have a question there? Or are you just adjusting your camera?
I was just adjusting the view. I'm
Well,
watching.
welcome.
I'm watching on an iPad, and so I gotta reach up to touch it.
I know that voice. Hi, Ken.
Hi.
I see. I'm still bringing people over, so please, if you want priority to come over, raise your hand and I'll jump right to you. It takes a while for the audio and video to catch up, so.
Ken, this is Dan Walker. How long did it take you to accumulate this material?
Oh gosh, my first big purchase, I bought a little bit before then, but my first big purchase was in 1994.
Okay.
So Robert, I was trying to bring you over as a panelist. If I can't, I did allow you to talk, so.
Dixon, you have a question?
Yes, just a quick comment. In the list of British consuls in the 18th century, there was a James Bruce of Kinnar, who is a famous Scottish explorer that spent several years in Ethiopia and wrote along the first account in English of life in that country. So, and a very famous person beyond briefly being, I think he was on his way to Ethiopia actually when he stopped and was consul in Algiers.
Hello, Ken. This is Bob Benninghoff.
Hi, Bob.
Up to everybody. There is a cover. I don't know if you know a business called War Covers, Richard Barton. He does have a cover there for sale. It's about £500 from a naval officer witnessing the bombardment of Algiers, written to Canada, to his, I think his brother in Canada. So if anyone wants to go and chase after it, it's a company called War Covers, and Richard Barton, B-A-R-T-O-N. I've been looking at it for a while, but it doesn't fit anything I collect, so I've avoided £500. But off to the right, it's an interesting letter, and it falls right in on your theme. So it's in the early 1800s.
Hello, if I could just comment.
Yes, go ahead, Rick. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I just say my wife's has genealogy goes back to what we know as New York in the early 1600s, Dutch, and one of the people in her family background was a pirate. He was a person from Holland, was kidnapped, taken down where the Barbary coast. He became a leader and somehow of the pirates, was very successful as a pirate, and then later went to what we know as New York City and settled there and became legitimate, I guess. Anyway, his life is fairly well documented. We know he had paid for his daughter to come down from Holland to visit him, where he was as well too. So my daughter was hoping to be on here today to hear it because she's done a lot more of the family history. But yeah, there's a lot of interesting information. I was completely unaware of the religious dynamics of the pirates, and that was very interesting. I would assume he was Christian, being from from Holland, but who knows? Okay. Now,
Well, we are recording this, Rick, so she's welcome to view it online. So it will be on
yeah,
YouTube.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Winston, you have a question?
Yes, good evening, Ken. It's Winston
Hi,
Williamson
Winston.
from England. Hello
Yeah.
there. Glad to see you in person
Yes.
now. My suggestion is, well, obviously, thank you very much for showing my sort of cover and giving its context and things. My suggestion why consuls might fund slavery ransom out of their own money is that they received money themselves for being consul and enabling trade, so that traders would pay the money to just try and make sure that to grease the wheels of commerce, so to speak. And so, yes, they did have to perhaps initially pay out for money that they'd received, pay out to ransom slaves, but obviously with the hope, as you say, of getting the money back from the church or the state or the families whose children they were ransoming.
Mhm. I agree. They hoped to be repaid, and I don't think they cared about the source.
Thank you.
Dick, are you still in France?
No, I'm in Lancaster, Pennsylvania tonight.
Oh, okay. Well,
Ken,
welcome.
I'm curious, how did you get interested in collecting this material?
Oh, well, somebody asked me when I was a neophyte if I collected the numeral cancels, and I said, oh yeah, I didn't know what the heck they were. And when I realized that Algiers had its own, or Algeria had its own numeral cancels, I delved into that and thought this will be kind of fun because there wasn't a lot of competition for that material. And it's grown way out of proportion, let's say.
Well, it's a great exhibit. Great talk. Thank you.
Thank you. My exhibit actually goes to, my collection goes to 1876. So I just chose to stop at the point where the French invaded Algiers.
When did didn't the United States get involved with the pirates?
The Marine hymn and its reference to the shores of Tripoli indeed showed up in the early 1800s, I believe, and suppressed the pirates.
I think Thomas Jefferson was involved in all of that.
Right. Yep.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Do we have any historians on?
The U.S. had a consul in Algiers, a guy named William Shaler, S-H-A-L-E-R, who also wrote a book, and I have that book on my shelf somewhere. But it isn't quite this period. He doesn't quite address what's going on. He was more 1820s.
I remember some of the language from Thomas Jefferson's letter where he's describing why they're going to Tripoli. He had strong feelings about what was going on. And it's not PC anymore. If you read it today, it's not PC.
Mm-hmm. He was very much opposed to paying tribute to anybody.
So who does the piracy in the Mediterranean these days? I know it's a sea like that. You're going to have some pirates. I mean, the Straits of Malacca, you still have it, and you can't cross the Horn of Africa. You can't cross get past out of the Red Sea, Red Sea Canal, the Suez Canal without hitting. Well, the Somalian pirates are troublesome. All those tight waterways, always piracy, someplace of some kind or other.
Yeah, all that we seem to hear about is the Somalis and the Straits of Malacca or somewhere down by Indonesia.
I wouldn't be surprised if the Bosphorus Straits got some pirates in there too.
Mhm.
Raj, I want to thank you for chiming in. You seem like you study this area.
More interested in missionary, military, and merchant mail. And I have a couple of letters from the French contingent in 1830 and 1833 from Algiers, and a couple of merchant letters from the 1760s from Tunisia when it was under Algeria. Algeria. So yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you.
I'm just
think
amazed
it's
all the
been a
material survived.
fascinating educational display, but far too early for my bad eyes, because the scrolling and the methods of writing in the early periods just defy me. How do you find deciphering what's in front of you from, for example, the 1600s?
I haven't done a very good job of that, but I typically look for recognizable words, because as in most spoken languages and many written languages, you'll see common words. Oftentimes you can start with the closure of a letter where the phrase is "your humble and obedient servant" or something like that, and it gets you into the handwriting enough that you can start to pick out a few words here and there, and the more you can pick out, the better you get.
I know someone. He was in academia in the languages department. There's no money in that anymore, but he makes his money now as a freelance translator, and he charges extra if he's dealing with cursive of any kind. So if you really want to find a good translator for that, find somebody who's got some chops in the linguistics department of a university, who's who's gone freelance, and pay the rate.
Right.
Winston, you had your hand up earlier. Did you? Hold on. Let me just get you down mute there.
I cheated. Although I studied Latin at school, I got somebody in the church to translate the letter that's written in Latin, to transcribe it, and then to translate it into English. It took me about 2 years of chasing around the church of the missionaries community to find somebody who could do a very good transcription and translation for me. So it takes time and perseverance, but it can be done.
Yes.
It must be difficult to get the nuances of the time also, opposed to just a literal translation.
It is, but if you've got a real scholar, somebody who knows his or her stuff, then they will assist you with the meaningful translation rather than just a pure transcription.
Mm-hmm.
One of the problems with early Latin was that they tended to write the first syllable and leave the rest to the reader to guess what the sense of the word was.
Oh, that might explain it. I have a 1712 missionary letter from India, from the Malabar coast, written in early Latin, and I have sent it to a couple of linguistic folks in Italy who translate Latin, and they said this is just too old Latin. We cannot translate it.
I think that's the same issue with my Milanese letter. It's if we think today to how people text each other and use LOL and BTW and all of that, that's the sort of thing they're doing in those old letters.
Mm-hmm.
Raj, find someone who's dealt with Roman coins.
Mm-hmm.
They do nothing but abbreviate. And also, no, I'm just sort of blowing my own horn. I've been trying to read Chinese and Japanese stamps. And the thing I've learned with when it comes to kanji, think of the character as a picture. Find a picture that has the same characters, and if it kind of matches, then you're in the neighborhood. Now, the thing is, there's a composite. There's actually a compound picture of different elephants, but I'd have to start with the Korean breakdown into 5 different characters, because Chinese has like a huge amount of characters, huge amount of elements. House is just the simplest of them, but you got to kind of break the code on these things. And with your Latin Roman coins are really the way to go.
Hi, Ken. I just checked war covers. The cover's still there. It actually describes the British Navy bombardment of 1816. It's a letter posted from Gibraltar to New Brunswick. But the letter is literally is a narrative.
Did it go through Halifax?
It went to Halifax.
Uh-oh.
So I don't know if
And it might be a rush.
Yeah.
Mention my name and you might get a little discount. But it's a nice letter. It's a nice. I've been watching it for a while, just from the historical point of view, but it's better suited to somebody that can put it in their collection.
I wanted to ask a little bit about technology between the Western powers and the Muslim powers, and it also shows up in Chinese history and Japanese history. It seems to me like it wasn't until the 19th century that the Western technology got so much better than anything else outside of the world that Perry could show up with a small fleet and the entire Japanese Navy would be like, oh, we can't handle this. And that might have been part of why they didn't suppress the piracy, in part because of effort, but also because they just had the technology better.
From what I've read in this, at least in this period, what I've read tells me that the Turks were busy collecting armaments as part of their tribute. So they got powder and cannons and guns and so on as payment from the Europeans for not attacking their shipping. So I don't think they were making much on their own.
Jerry, you have a question.
It was a comment more than a question. My late father, many years ago, had a family document from the 14th or 15th century actually translated. It was a very ornate thing with very fancy calligraphy. It was written in Latin, and he was able to find I don't know if it was a professor or a student at a local university who was able to transcribe it and then also translate it into both English and Polish for us. It took I don't think he had to pay for it, but I think he gave the person an honorarium of some sort. But if you look, you can find these people. But not easy. No, Latin isn't a language that many people are familiar with. Although it's probably more familiar than some of the older languages. That's just a comment.
My observations and your display, Ken, there is more than one language in the early period, as well as your Milanese, Spanish, no doubt some mixture of Italian and North African dialects. I just don't know, which makes any translation not a walk in the park. It's going to be difficult. And from my own perspective, once anything gets to the point of pre-stamp, I sort of lose a bit of interest. because I can't read it. And even if it's written in English, I find it very, very difficult. And on my wall to my right side here, I've got some old indentures, which are beautiful to look at and very scrolly. And they date back to, I think it's 1591 or that sort of period. I can only read the top line, and I've had them for 40 years. So it is not easy to read any form of old scripture, because the style is different. The writing itself is, can I say, floral, but the method of speak is alien to this century.
And it's before what in America was Noah Webster. So people spell things differently, and you have to fight your way through that as well.
Of course.
There's in French correspondence, there's almost no punctuation. It's very hard to pick out where sentences start and stop.
Mm.
But
Yeah,
you're right.
like,
In my collection of Algerian postal history, I have what we saw today. So the Milanese, Italian, English, French, Spanish. I have Old Hebrew that nobody around me has been able to read. And what am I missing? I've got at least one more language I've overlooked, but there's lots of them.
Old Hebrew? Find someone who's participated in writing at least one Talmud Torah scroll. Seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Then you learn all, there's the calligraphic styles of writing a Torah scroll, but they have to write that flawlessly. So they're probably going to, they probably will know or be able to read this style. I want to say that I'm doing some work on China right now, and I'm 58, and I have a feeling I don't think I would trust a scholar under 30 to handle a lot of this material because they're just dumb. They're not taught to know these things. They're not taught to care about these things.
I think you underestimate the younger generation there, Edward,
Maybe
because there are plenty, I've met plenty of very young, competent scholars, and a lot of them are into document presentation and preservation. So I wouldn't write them out. They probably say the same thing about the old folks, and their hands tremble so much they're going to tear the paper. So
as an editor, I can assure you that problems of lack of punctuation and lack of spelling have not changed. They're as bad today as they were in the 18th century.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Find the right graduate student. Find the right graduate student who's trying to learn something other than English, and you'll be happy to practice on your document.
Fair enough. Although I'm studying on history, and I'm noticing that the knowledge of history, people's studying of history is flawed by this one assumption. It's what should be, what should have been. And if you're dealing with history, you're only dealing with what was, and maybe what could have been. But what should have been, it's too late for that now.
anyway, Ken, the letters like yours are great because they give a great firsthand account into history. And that's one of the reasons why, no offense, Mike, I like postal history and pre-stamps, because some of the things that you get out of these letters are just fantastic. And Bob Vogel, I don't think they forge many stampless covers, do they?
I'm sorry, what's that, Joan?
Do they forge stampless covers a lot?
You'll
Okay.
have to ask our friend Ken Pugh. He's the expert on forgeries.
Yeah.
I'd like to say, Ken, that was a very interesting presentation tonight. A great history lesson for me. That's an area I didn't know much about. I still don't know much about it, but you've certainly enlightened me tonight for sure. Thank you.
You're welcome, Bob.
Rich, you have a question?
Ken, you spoke of the difficulties in deciphering cursive. And in this country now, you're going to be hard pressed to find anybody under 30 who writes or reads in cursive. And another language that might have been distinct at that time would have been Venetian, as distinct from Italian.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe another source of that kind of scholarship, early music. People who read or study early music, they dig into the documents.
Right.
The people I know in early music get a little strange sometimes, but they tend to know, they tend to need to read that stuff.
Rick, you have a question or a comment?
While we're into resources, genealogy is a gold mine for this kind of stuff. I did work on my family history in England, back 500-600 years. I got booklets explaining the script. On one of those documents you showed today, I saw that script was the same that they were using in England. They tended to have standard scripts used all across Europe for legal purposes, for communication purposes. I think maybe originally governed by the Pope in Rome or the Emperor or something, but there was a definite commonality in the scripts that they used for writing things. And you get into genealogy resources, and there's always people in some old document translated, and you can get connections for people that can do the translations or help you out with it. I got a big book or publication, I should say, that mentioned the common abbreviations, for example, that you'd find in Old English documents and etc. So I would say go into some genealogy channels and start to explore there and see if you can't find someone that has a family history from Milan and they need to get stuff translated or something like that, and there would be good resources there.
So Ken, putting on your judge hat, you're a judge, right?
Yes.
Would you get points, brownie points for translating those letters as an exhibitor?
Not for being the translator, but if you find something in that letter that advances your story, yes.
Okay. But no A++ for doing the whole thing.
No.
Okay. Nice to know.
Unless it was from Halifax.
Yeah, I think I'll get that into everyone. When it's at CAPEX, I had 3 of my competitors come up to me, and now I understand why everything starts at a very low price and then just overshoots my budget. So.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had occasion to reach out to families of people who were involved in the letters that that were involved in this material?
I haven't searched for anybody who might still be alive. No.
Wow. Well, does anyone else? Fernando, you've been very quiet there.
No, so I wanted to say thanks. It was an amazing presentation. I didn't know much about this topic, so it's always good to learn something new. And if you want, Ken, I may be able to help you with the Spanish documents while you were showing them. Well, I didn't have time, of course, to read everything, but I was able to learn many words. So I probably will be able to help you with them. Maybe not the full translation, but at least something to give you an idea.
Which is really what it's what I seek. Word for word, I don't know is of value.
But I can share with you my email, and maybe, well, I can give you something that you can work on.
I would appreciate that very much. We can work through Joan so that isn't part of our recording.
Okay.
Yeah, I love people who give out credit cards over the Zoom, right?
Right.
My Halifax collection gets bigger. Anyway, well, thank you. And Joseph, you're quiet there too.
Talking about me, Joseph.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, I'm a lapsed philatelist. I'm actually a numismatist now, and my specialty is counterfeit paper money. And there's not much paper money from the period that Ken was dealing with today, but I spent 2 years in Morocco as a child in an Air Force family, and I've been back to Morocco twice since then. I did collect all of North Africa at one point before I concentrated in Japan. So I've got a long-standing interest in this part of the world. And being a World War II scholar, I'm also interested in that because we fought all through that area in 1942-44.
I know what I'm working on now. It's not fully philatic, but it's a letter from a Chinese Kuomintang officer writing to the representatives in an internment camp in northern China. And you know, the fun thing about it is he studied English in France, but his English has a lilt to it because it's his second language. That's just fun.
I learned a lot today, Ken. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. For any other questions for Ken? Going once, going twice, isn't it? Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you very much for all you did too, Rob. He's really a big help there. And Henning, I like your background. It's gorgeous lake. So, Raj, you were just a treasure of information. But thank you, Ken. Thank you very, very much. I think this is fascinating.
You're all very welcome. I appreciate the invitation, Joan.
Well, you're welcome back anytime. It's a little scary to think that if you lived back then, you could have been no women pirates though. You didn't mention a single woman pirate.
No, I don't know of a record of any. No.
I would think there would be some.
Yeah, you would think.
Yeah.
There was a woman pilot in the Caribbean whose death sentence was commuted because she was pregnant.
In fact, when I was a kid, my ambition was to be a pirate. It never transpired. I did, though, get as far as buying a boat, which cost me a marriage. But that's a whole different story.
Wow. Ken, did you ever travel to that part of the world?
No.
Yeah, okay.
No, it's let's say politically unsettled enough that I would not be comfortable there.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's scary.
Do we get to make a crack about being apprenticed to a pilot from Pinafore? No, Pirates of Penzance.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna. What was it? Puff the Magic Dragon is the other song I was gonna play as it came in because that was the only thing I found in Google that said pirate. But, anyway.
Well, I noticed Penzance named on that slide about Baltimore, Ireland, and that immediately brought the Pirates of Penzance straight to my mind.
Huh. Okay, anything else? I thank everyone for joining, and we can hang out as long as you want. I'm not going to cut you off, but
Go home. Right.
but Keith was saying that I have to feed him.
Go home.
And I ran into you first at, in conjunction with the Philatelic Forensic Organization. I was at that forensic seminar at, up in Chicago about 5 years ago, and it opened up a lot of interesting areas for me to use in numismatic forensics in my paper money studies. I just wish I could afford some of that hardware.
Right. Yep. Well, we're looking to put on a 5th symposium in the autumn 2023.
Jerry, jump right in. You don't have to raise your hand.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Ken, for a very interesting talk. I always like to join these philatelic forums to learn something. And as a matter of fact, I was on a session earlier today that Vogel was on too. And that was one of the things that came up. You know, we learn things from these sessions. As a matter of fact, I think one of your future presenters, Garfield Porch, was hosting that session. So I'm going to look forward to that. And I've seen your sessions with Ken Pugh and whatnot too, that I also know from the Zoom sessions. So, you know, I saw the topic, Barbary Coast. I said, what am I going to learn? Well, I learned stuff today.
Okay, are we all set?
Yep. Yeah.
I'm not rushing you. I don't mean to rush you, but I know Ken's there.
Nobody's got anything for me. I'll say good night and thank everybody for their attention.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you so much. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to the British Empire Study Group on Bastille Day. And happy Bastille Day to everybody, an appropriate topic that we're having tonight. So for those of you who haven't joined us before, we are the British Empire Study Group. We are made up of men and women who have an interest in the British Empire. That's a very broad term. So we do a lot of social things, and we would usually meet in Midtown Manhattan, but the Collectors Club is doing some reorganization, so we're open to spots. And for the near future, we'll be doing webinars like this predominantly. So what is the British Empire? We take a very liberal view of the British Empire. We even like our French people here. And so basically, if it's flown over the British Empire, if it was once part of the British Empire, if mail went through the country, even though it's not part of the British Empire, it's all fair game for us. So just a little housekeeping. Our next meeting will be on Zoom on August 11th, and that's with Garfield. He'll be going over Toronto Post Office's Part 2. He has a great new discovery when he was up in Capex. He wouldn't really tell me about it, but he said we'll be surprised. So a little more housekeeping. If you could feel free to chat. It would be nice if you put the questions either in the Q&A or the chat. Following the presentation, there'll be a social discussion. So if you'd like to wait and just talk to Ken or Rob directly, feel free. If you don't like those little closed captions, if they're coming up, please just click on the disable closed subtitles and you could disable them. If you don't see that button, hit the more, and then you'll see the disable the live transcripts. If you're interested in any topics, please let us know. And I just wanted to, at this time, if you have your gallery up, you'll see Rob Luton's here. He's going to be introducing our speaker. And I'm not going to try Ken's last name because I'm going to butcher it again, but Ken is a fantastic person. So Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you to do the introductions if I could.
All right.